Yes, thank you. And to all of your viewers and members, I am honored to share my evening, your day with you. As mentioned, I'm going to give a talk really on how to think about conducting strategic scenario analysis for economic security. That means we have big words there, but what do they really mean? It's how do we think about imagining alternative futures that allow us to understand risk and opportunity as it relates to economic activity. And I'm going to particularly focus it from a business perspective so that we can think about how businesses that actually make up the vast majority of economic activity in free societies like Japan and the United States, uh, while ultimately really the lifeblood of our well-being, are also at risk in a new era of strategic competition. So sometimes I believe you have to start a talk where you will end it. So kind of to telegraph where we will go quickly in my evening and your day is I want to tell you a series of stories about economic risk and how to think about the fragility of our economy in a way that allows you to kind of analyze your own business practices and work with your government in a way that allows you to create a more resilient ecosystem. So if you will give me a moment, I will share my slides and we can begin. So first, you might be wondering, who is this big goofy American named Ben Jensen, and why are we here to hear him speak? And if I had to summarize for you why I'm here, I've spent the last 20 years as a mix of a professor and a soldier. And in that journey, I've fought three wars. I've written five books. And all of it, if I had to summarize it, really deals with helping a mix of governments, major businesses, and international organizations solve complex problems defined by rapid change and high levels of uncertainty. And so I'm really talking to you about complex systems tonight. And I think, and I know from experience, that geopolitics, economics, and technological change create a degree of complexity that often make it difficult to make stable predictions about future business practices. And so while most of my kind of journey to get to this point to reflect and share with you has been a function of war and international security and peace building, I've known in the last really 5 years in particular that these insights are especially important for major businesses. Most of my time now isn't spent as a soldier or necessarily writing about war. It's actually helping businesses directly think about geopolitical risk and think about the type of changes in the international system that could cause cascading risks into their organization. And that's really what I want to focus with you tonight to talk about. Are there particular methods that help us understand very uncertain systems? So, as you know, many of you have a business background and an economics background. When you have a system with low uncertainty, forecasting is relatively straightforward. We understand the error terms. We can actually look at whether we do a straight line extrapolation or how we analyze trend lines to actually, make a prediction. But the more uncertain the system, the harder it is to make those predictions. And so I want to introduce to you tonight is why actually, becoming a child again and being playful is probably actually the most astute form of analysis the professional can do. The more uncertain the system, the higher the degree of playfulness the analyst has to open themselves to see the degrees of freedom and the possibility of change. And so, to kind of summarize what I've just said in really simple terms, you know this, you live this, you deal with this with your shareholders, with your employees, with your business partners. The interconnected global economy demands a particular type of more astute analysis means that it's not like the Cold War anymore. There's a degree of predictability. But the major political competitions that define our world, of which Japan is stuck in the middle, whether it's the challenge of North Korea, Russia, or kind of shifting politics in China, all of those deal with markets, both import and export, and in particular, key resources Japan relies upon to maintain its economic position. And that means that Japanese businesses and the government have to find a way of understanding how this world of great power competition creates a particular category of economic and business risk. And as I mentioned before, because there's a high degree of uncertainty, it really means we have to get creative. And that creativity, at least in my experience, is best captured through a mix of tabletop exercises, so games, that allow you to actually create alternative futures, scenarios. And through telling those stories collectively, has an analytical team begin to make assessments about risk. Now, obviously, fairy tales aren't, really how we should make business decisions. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm trying to share with you is that because of these complexities and because of a world that's pivoting towards higher risks of conflict, and even when it's not conflict, economic coercion and cyber campaigns that you've lived with, I've lived with, all of those create new risk vectors that are subject to significant change. So the old idea about chaos theory, that a butterfly can flap its wings and create maybe unpredictable storms somewhere in the world. Ladies and gentlemen, that's our world. And if you live in that world, it actually requires the eye of interactions, an eye towards feedback loops, an eye towards action, reaction, and counteraction to be able to generate those scenarios, to be able to plan. And traditional forecasting techniques are just not sufficient for that anymore. Therefore, we have to open our mind to different categories of analysis. And tonight's real focus will be on games. So I'll really walk you through two sections and then preserve time for questions and answers, because this is best described in a dialogue, not necessarily in a lecture. And so the first section, I'm going to share with you games that I've built, and really explain to you, why do we game? Why do we build these tabletop exercises? Why do we analyze emergent possibilities that emerge from games as a way of making either political or business decisions? And so I'm really going to center those on stories. I'm going to be very open, transparent, and honest with you about partners and clients I've supported. What was their core question? And why did a game make sense? And what did the game help us do? And given that vantage point, we'll then pivot to have a brief discussion on how do you actually design games optimized to analyze economic security. So the first part of the discussion will be really a discussion about stories, about why should you game to understand complexity. And the second half will be, okay, if you are willing to entertain the idea that games are a viable form of analysis, then how do we design games specifically oriented towards questions involving economic security? So to begin, let's have our discussion about why we game. So if nothing else, take away this. Games help visualize and describe complex interactions. Tonight's discussion, or your morning discussion, is about complexity and complex systems, whether it's nature or stories or even our own personal lives, are subject to emergent properties, meaning that they're sudden to small changes that cascade. And those cascading effects, the change in the system, is usually a function of how a collection of individuals make decisions based upon calculating risk and opportunity, and not just any opportunity, but thinking through the opportunity costs. So games help us describe a tendency and potential in the making of our world. So first, let me start with that concept of interesting decisions. As a 50-year-old man, I've grown up playing games all my life. Many of you probably out there have as well. And my favorite game designer of all time made a game that I've played since I was a teenager called Civilization. His name was Sid Meier. And Sid Meier built games throughout the 80s and continues to this day. But he was actually quoted as saying, when someone asked him as an artist, like, what is it really at the essence of a game? He said, all games come down to a series of interesting decisions, meaning the game design must capture those key decisions that players will make to cause this type of interesting unfolding into the future. Now, I bring up that quote because every game that I've built to try to understand complexity pivots on his concept of trying to understand whether it's economic security or geopolitics, trying to understand who are the players and what are the interesting decisions they have to make. So let me give you an example. The images you see there on your screen under that series of interesting decisions are actually directly from a game I made for all of the congressional members in the US. So in 2023, I was asked to go to Florida and help all of the Republicans in the US Congress try to understand the risks of a possible conflict over Taiwan. And so, as part of that offsite, so now I want you to think of this a large auditorium, over 200 elected officials with very different viewpoints. And we had 1 hour, myself, and then the senior elected officials. So the Speaker of the House, the House of Armed Services Committee, all of the major committees were represented, and they were playing their roles from the US government. And the series of interesting decisions we modeled for them were about how escalation decisions, political decisions a US politician could make, the president in particular, if China should actually try to use military force to threaten to Taiwan, how those would produce both a loss of life, economic costs. And that was the series of interesting decisions, that it wasn't just a decision to go to war, it was the way that you actually chose to communicate with your adversary, communicate with your own society, produced a series of options. And so to build that game, even though the game was very short, it was only 2 hours, we had to do months of work to model over 200 distinct possible outcomes that could actually capture every decision the players made. So again, a game should be a series of interesting decisions, and it should lend itself to wide degrees of variation. But that range of variation should capture plausible scenarios that reflect upon the risks at hand. So in this case, it was the US elected officials, but in each of your case, it might be a question of supplier risk, market disruptions that link to major exogenous shocks, whether it's some kind of security crisis in the Asia Pacific, or a new trade war, or even a domestic shock, an earthquake, or a natural disaster that can ripple through. So sometimes games help you imagine the range of outcomes based upon a series of interesting decisions. Now, in the middle of the slide, I'll orient you to the second kind of thing that games do. So not only do they help you visualize and describe complexity, the purpose of that visualization, the purpose of that kind of worlding, that creating a scenario, is to allow players, to allow senior leaders to try to assess risk and opportunities. It's one thing to make a rational calculation, increase your benefits, decrease your costs with perfect information in a safe place. It is an entirely different thing to increase the level of uncertainty and then ask someone to assess their risk and opportunities. So games become a kind of safe space for senior leaders to think about the inherent trade-offs in the type of decisions they'll make. And I'll give you two quick examples from that from games I've built. So the top one is something that was called the U.S. Cyberspace Solarium Commission. So this was a prominent congressional commission in 2019 and 2020 that actually led to over 80 pieces of legislation and the creation of the National Cyber Directorate in the United States government. As a congressional commission, that meant that as the senior research director, my job was to create games and analytical forums that allowed senators and major businesses. So in this context, we had both elected officials, both parties, so it was bipartisan. And we had the CEO of one of the largest electric companies in the United States, and also representatives from major interest groups all come together, and we had them play games to try to imagine cyber risks. Again, not every threat, not every opportunity is in the present. So a game allows you to step outside yourself to assess risk and opportunities. A second example, below it, a lot of the work I've done in the last really 3 years has been imagining or helping both, particularly the US government, but also businesses, really think through generative artificial intelligence and how it will change their world. And so this has gone from everything from imagining the AI risks inherent in the largest questions in US national security. So the degree to which states using AI create nuclear escalation risks, all the way to analyzing how we can use AI to think about the way strategic competition impacts businesses. So that's a link to an article where we reflect upon some of those exercises to really look at how artificial intelligence changes planning. But the key insight that I'm sharing with you as an author is that all of those ideas come from putting people in a game, putting people in a position where they are imagining either different forms of artificial intelligence to augment strategy and decision making, or actually giving them AI-enabled tools to help them make decisions, and then analyzing how they assess risk and opportunity. So again, games are a safe way to allow people to imagine different worlds. And then the last story I'll share with you on this slide as we think about games and how they help us visualize complexity really deals with economic coercion. And this is something that your businesses, your country, just as my country, has been subject to as we deal with the rise of authoritarian states. And so about 2 years ago, the Office of Net Assessment, so a famous strategy organization in the United States, approached some economists and asked them if they could do a study on how should free societies, so the G7, respond to economic coercion. And I think we know what country they had in mind. And as part of that study, I was contracted to develop a game, and a game that would simulate economic coercion. And so we actually, in this case, did a large number of case studies, a large number of deep dives into real world examples of economic coercion to design a series of interesting decisions. So in this case, we actually used a fake country so people wouldn't be biased, and then analyze the different economic coercive instruments a particular state could have over another state, using it though as a way to visualize and describe the opportunity cost. So when I say opportunity cost there, invoking the famous economic concept, right? That you might think you have a beneficial solution, but there's always some trade-off. So again, games don't just help you analyze interesting decisions about modern statecraft and strategy and their effects on economic security. They allow you to assess risk, and they also allow you to describe opportunity costs. And because games are playful, they deal inherently with interaction, imagination, and decision making. That offers a vehicle to capture the high degrees of uncertainty, the tendency and potential that differentiates the present from alternative futures. Now, another key aspect of games, good games help players analyze interactions over time. So a game shouldn't just visualize and describe complexity, it should actually offer an analytical forum in which the players can analyze possible exchanges they might have in both a adversarial context, so whether that's war, the traditional form of a war game, but also in terms of business competition, or my favorite games actually to build are ones that don't deal with overt conflict or overt business competition, but sometimes deal with actual economic cooperation. How do you get countries to, or even organizations in government to cooperate. And I'm going to give you a couple of techniques that are helpful to analyzing interactions based upon gaming, and again, give you real world examples. So the first image there is why systems fail. Now, this becomes from in 2020, in the height of the pandemic, I was asked by the US government, the US Northern Command, to be part of a red team to imagine just how bad the pandemic could get. Now, I'm sure you remember the early stages of the pandemic. None of us knew how bad it was going to get. And really, fear dominated a lot of our decision making. And so in this case, we had to try to understand the worst case scenario. We had to model the complexity of how bad things could get. And so we use games as a way, very depressing time, to model the way the US economy could potentially utterly collapse through a mix of actually what we modeled were racial injustice and protests. So we did that before the George Floyd outbreak. We did it based upon thinking also about transportation and logistics. The US economy is fundamentally dependent on mid-range and long-range trucking. So it's not just our ports and our airports that matter, but the size of the country in terms of its landmass means if trucking goes down, a lot of the country quickly falls apart. And why that matters is back then, the pandemic infection rates for mortality definitely mapped the profile of your average trucker. The average long haul trucker in the United States was an elder male who's overweight. So the highest candidate at that time to die from COVID. And we also found from historical studies we modeled then in the game that every pandemic in history has been associated with social and civil unrest, which was shocking at the time because you would think people would go to their homes and try not to get infected. But it turns out there's a real mental health toll on the kind of way we all get locked down. And so whether it was Victorian England or other cases, we found social unrest. So again, good games help players analyze interactions. We were using games not in a playful way, but to really look at the types of interactions that could really push the US economy and society into its worst case. Second, on red teaming. This is an example, and you can click on any one of these. They're happy to share the slides with you. All of these link to articles that are written about these games and these analytical efforts. Red teaming is a form of alternative analysis in the United States that really helps you deal with high uncertainty. And so that entire article really describes a series of studies I did when General Milley, the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, had just become the head of the Army. He actually asked a group to come together, a strategic studies group, and I was one of those members, and have us think about what the future of war would be. So this was 2015. He asked us to imagine what war would be in 2035. And what quickly became apparent is that big organizations have real problems in making long-term forecasts because there's a lot of incentives to assume the present will continue into the future. It's almost cultural as much as it's institutional. No one wants to be embarrassed. And so we had to actually create games that acted as a red team. We assumed failure. We assumed alternatives so that it created a contrarian perspective that helped senior leaders think. Two last examples before we move on as well. Not just interactions in terms of players, but sometimes it's okay to introduce game theory and formal modeling to actually act as a complement to human decision making. And what I mean by that is it's one thing to bring together a group of subject matter experts, and model a series of interesting decisions, whether it's about responding to a rival power, so the US-China relationship, responding to a pandemic, thinking about cybersecurity. It's another thing to try to abstract their decisions into a formal economic model that gets you at a more pure form of rationality. And I'm a big believer as a researcher that more methods are better, that you should try to create parsimonious economic models, as well as watch the messiness of human players arguing and making decisions. And so that middle graphic is an example of this. For a large Fortune 100 company, my team was asked to try to understand competition in the shadow of technology. So what does that mean? It means exactly what you just saw China do when they revealed the new J-36 sixth generation fighter. It was trying to model and understand incentives for states to reveal new technology as a form of signaling and long-term competition. And so why I bring that up is that a good game should be complemented by other rigorous analytical methods. And it's already gone without saying, the last image, that if you good games help players analyze interactions over time, it's not just towards current decision making, it's always with an eye towards the future. So that last report that you can find hyperlinked deals with findings from tabletop games that my team did with chief information security officers from major companies in the US federal government, in which you have to identify the right players so they can make that they understand the decision. You wouldn't want to go get unemployed people to model decision making of the leaders of companies. It wouldn't make any sense. Just like leaders of companies wouldn't understand what it was like to be a unemployed person looking for a job. So you have to actually get the right type of players with the right expertise so they actually know the types of decisions they're making if you really want to model a series of alternative futures. And in this case, we really focused on cyber futures and whether or not the existing structure of cybersecurity in the US government was sufficient to protect critical infrastructure. Which I think is actually, if any of these reports so far was really important to the Japanese business community, this is the one because it really walks you into some of the complexities of public-private partnership, resilience, questions of economic security that emerge from the benefits of interdependence. One of the central dilemmas of our modern world is the more interconnected we become, the more economically prosperous. We find efficiencies, we trade and exchange goods and ideas. But the more interdependent we become, it actually turns out the more risk we're assuming. In network theory, it's called a scale-free network, meaning that the centrality of the network, basically meaning it's confined to just a few key pieces of critical infrastructure, means that unless those are protected and resilient, the entire system is fragile and can be prone to sudden shocks. Closing out stories about games before we think about how you build them, we've talked about you use games to model complexity. And modeling complexity involves thinking about how players with agency, meaning free will choices, make interesting decisions over time. So a game has to take uncertainty seriously. It has to model that complexity and use player choices, those interactions over time, to imagine alternative futures. Now, what does that ultimately get you in terms of thinking about economic security? I actually think it all boils down to risk. So I don't think I mean, you can use games, and I've built those games to actually model market potential, like what investments would you make to capture a particular market. But the best games I've ever built all deal with more creative forms of risk analysis. How do you conduct risk analysis, whether in terms of thinking about risk, risk at the country level, risk at the regional level, and then even risk in terms of individual business sectors? So good games model systems of interaction, but they model the systems in order to help players, in your cases, businesses, think about risk and resilience. So let me give you a few examples. So the first report there is really more methodological. And it's from the series that we put together in my futures lab called On Future War. But to be honest, most of what we write about isn't war. It's really about thinking about complexity. And in this case, we really took to task or analyzed hard how the US government models risk. Um, it turns out that most governments struggle to deal with risk. And I say that because most of their techniques for analyzing risk are fundamentally antiquated compared to modern insurance industries or even the private sector. They tend to think of risk as independent and discrete, meaning risk events are one off, and that's it. You have risk and then you don't have risk. When actually, in the real world, in a complex system, risk is often continuous. It's not discrete. It doesn't just happen once, and interdependent, meaning one risk event cascades and creates other risk events. Yet, if you were to pull manuals, and I'm assuming this is the case, I don't know for Japan, and definitely for the US government in the military, the way they treat risk hasn't evolved since the 1950s. It's composite risk management that has a fundamentally flawed assessment of risk. So, games have led my team to the perspective of trying to understand new and innovative ways for thinking about risk. So, seeing it as a continuum and series of interdependent events as opposed to a one off series of catastrophes. And in that, a lot of the games increasingly that my team builds are really about different categories of risk. So the country risk study you see there is this summer. I went and worked with the Taiwanese Banking Federation to actually try to understand all of the ways short of war China could conduct a full economic coercive campaign and cyber coercive campaign that caused shock and dislocation in Taiwanese society. So, this study and others, you can look up another one I've written called What If, have led me to believe that actually China is not likely to conduct a large scale amphibious operation to invade Taiwan because there are so many other ways that they can undermine cohesion in Taiwanese society and use economic levers short of war. And just a historical note, even the United States military in the Second World War decided not to invade Taiwan because of the complexities of the terrain. It is some of the worst possible terrain to fight on the planet. But that study right there really came from going to Taiwan, working with their business community, working with their business leaders, and with like senior US former intelligence officials to build a game that allowed us to think about economic coercion and cyber risk. The other two studies deal with sector and regional risks. So the one in the middle describes a game that we built with members of the Filipino National Security Council to actually try to understand risks in the Philippines related to their energy sector. So the Philippines is highly exposed to the basically Chinese ownership of their energy grid and where they think they're going to get their energy in the future. They're either going to import liquefied natural gas or they're going to develop gas in their own areas. The problem for the Philippines is all of the hydrocarbon resources they would like to develop are in territory disputed with China. And China, at the same time, because it's actually subsidized its green energy industry, is overwhelming the Philippines with solar panels, wind, as well as using its Belt and Road Initiative and other vehicles to invest in the Filipino energy grid. And so that game helped us try to help the Philippines understand some of those risks and trade-offs and how do you achieve energy independence and energy security without necessarily losing economic ground. And then the last example there deals really, this is one of my favorite ones with regional dimensions. So in this case, the game helped us think about the risk of Chinese investments in dams in the Mekong region. So, you all are probably aware that as China has modernized, it's built a large degree of infrastructure, both in its country, in the region, and globally. And some of the challenges is how this infrastructure produces downstream effects. So in this case, a lot of the Chinese dams have significant impacts on the Mekong River region in terms of changing water flows, which change economic livelihood and even change human settlement patterns. And so, to try to help USAID and the State Department understand that, my colleagues and I built a game about water security. So, again, good games model complex systems in a way that the players, which are usually experts and policy officials, can think about risk And it's not just think about risk, it's think about risk with an eye towards mitigating risk and building more resilient systems over time. And so now that I've walked you through 12 different stories of games that deal with and really, again, the central theme is you actually build games as an analytical vehicle to analyze complexity, understand risk in terms of a series of interesting decisions that different actors make. And you're not just analyzing risk to admire it, you're analyzing risk to both see how to mitigate it, where there might be opportunities, and ultimately how to create more resilient organizations that can manage increasingly uncertain and complex systems. And my going in assumption is that we're entering a world where there will be higher degrees of uncertainty. And so if those are examples of games, let me just share with you quickly a few more specific corporate examples and talk about how do you actually design games to analyze economic security at the level of an individual business. And so the first, and by the way, I've given you examples of the clients before. Now I'm dealing with very specific companies and I have non-disclosure agreements with them. So I'm not going to share with you what companies I'm talking about, but they are all extremely large companies that you have likely either done business with or bought their products. So our first corporate story deals with really trying to understand cascading risk. So this company, which was a major retail firm, approached Bauer Group Asia and contracted my services to try to understand where would a potential political flashpoint, and I'm going to keep it abstract intentionally, produce risk in their current business operation. So in this case, the company was very concerned after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, how that might set a global precedent and how it might actually catch them unprepared, meaning another country might get invaded and they have capital, money stuck in other countries. They have workforce, their employees stuck. They're all of a sudden finding themselves the victim of larger political clash. You know, ships carrying their goods are sunk or impounded in port. Their insurance premiums are going up. They're getting, hit by cyber attacks that weren't even targeting them, but they're an innocent bystander. So that's that concept of cascading risks in a complex system. And that meant we had to build a game that helped senior executives really model the interdependencies they had, think about what type of events would amplify, meaning get worse over time, really come up with a concept of time. How long would it take one event to impact different parts of their business? And ultimately, really understand the chain of events and the interactions and feedback loops that would impact them. So really, again, that central theme I mentioned before, this company wanted a game that helped them imagine critical risk events, and not just in terms of the shock, oh no, this happened, but how shock events cascade and complicate areas of their business that weren't immediately obvious. So if a game models a series of interesting decisions, it also actually shows the pathways along which a shock event can ripple through your business. What's interesting is the more games like this I've done, you go into it as someone outside the business thinking, oh, the most important thing to them is going to be their money. How do I move my money? How do I protect my money? No, most of the folks, when you really get them behind closed doors, and this is actually a good testament to their humanity, are concerned about their employees. They don't want their employees to be held hostage. They don't want their employees to feel trapped in other countries. So a lot of these cascading risk discussions aren't just about economic security of their business portfolio, but it's seeing their employees as part of that. And they have not just a fiduciary responsibility to shareholders, they also have a responsibility to the humans that work for them, to the people, to their families. Now, the second story is another example of cascading risk, but this one really focused on complex supply chain. So in this case, this was a large food company And the food company actually sourced its commodities globally. So their challenge was there was one market that they were worried might fall apart because of a war. And at the same time, that war would have global consequences. So even though they were sourcing some of their goods in Southeast Asia, they were sourcing other goods in Africa, their ability to load those onto ships and move them on sea lines of communication were already going to be at risk. And so it was really a question of trying to build a game that helped them analyze the complexity of modern supply chains in terms of, again, trade-offs and opportunity costs. So can I move it by ship? Can I move it by rail? Can I find alternative suppliers? So a lot of that game, and like any good economic security game does this, should map and understand interdependencies. Where are businesses, countries, like societies dependent on one another? And the game should also assess vulnerabilities and single points of failure. So where are things likely to fall apart? Can I see it? Can I understand it? Where are those key points of vulnerability, those critical vulnerabilities? And both of those are imply using scenario analysis to simulate risk. Basically, through analyzing these possible failures, through analyzing interdependencies, it allows you to have a more comprehensive approach to risk analysis. And in the end, the ultimate benefit of that, why most businesses really like to do these games with me, is you end up building better contingency plans. So if you've imagined all of these, all the complexity, the interactions, the possible outcomes, and all of those risk vectors, you begin to look at near-term actions that can build resilience, and then the type of contingency plans that you can enact in the second a crisis starts. So, you'll never be able to predict the future, but the more time you spent thinking about alternative possibilities and building yourself options, the easier it is to confront those complexities. And so that means let me close with some guiding principles on game design. Because I've talked a lot with you about complex games with very senior political or business leaders having to, come to a setting, play a game, which sounds odd. We don't think of like elected officials or millionaires and billionaires wanting to play games, but games are the most natural things we do as humans. We play games since the time we're a child. So sometimes putting the most powerful people in a room where they can be playful and they can think and they can play and imagine possibilities is itself more important than any outcome. It actually frees up creativity and lets people have a deeper insight. But if you're going to do that, a few guiding principles. Number one, most firms and people who build games, in my opinion, violate the most simple rule. And that is games should not be complex. A good game has simple rules, and if you have a good game with simple rules, and you think of Go, you think of chess, you think of any one of a number of games you played, they weren't complex, they were simple because they allowed people to make decisions, and those decisions generated outcomes. So the first rule of good game design is simple rules plus good players equals key insights. If you want to analyze economic security, if you want to really think about risk and complexity in the global economy, do games, you need to take enough time to build the simplest possible game and make sure you invite the right players. If your game is too complex or you have the wrong players in the room, you're just not going to generate the right type of insights. Second, move with the terrain. And what I mean by that is games shouldn't be long and painful. They should be short and insightful. So that means the best, especially for the more senior the executive, the less time they have. When you're working with elected officials or senior business leaders, they can't give you days. They can give you hours at most. So understand that audience. If you want to work with powerful people, respect their time. And that means your game shouldn't just be simple, they should be short and meaningful. And the shorter and sharper your game is, the more meaningful your game is, the more it sticks with the players. And a game is only as good as the recall of the players because you'll document your game. Like whenever I do a game for someone, I have to write a report. I give them the report, they analyze it, they share it. But reading the report is different than triggering those playful neural pathways in their brain to remember playing the game. So ultimately, if you have the right players, that means you have decision makers, and the game was short enough, interesting enough, they remember it the next time they confront a crisis. Third, data capture is critical. If you're going to write a report, you have to have data, and your data should be well structured, linked to a set of assumptions that you can test, probe, and analyze. That means you should actually think like a scientist, even though you're playing like a child. So a good game should allow, it should be simple, players should have fun. But while you, as the facilitator or your data capture team, is watching people play, you're actually carefully recording their choices, documenting them, and analyzing them. So my team at CSIS, every game we run, we do detailed data capture, everything from the choices people make. When groups permit it, we record the audio and we do natural language processing and topic modeling. So we use artificial intelligence to analyze their conversations to provide even deeper insights. And then last, number four, don't over engineer your game. This goes back to simple rules. A lot of games try to model complexity by modeling every possible choice. And that's actually not the right approach. You want to have your games be about a series of interesting decisions that allow you to understand risk and opportunities and alternative futures. And the best way to do that is let your players' choices produce complexity. You don't produce complexity and then drop the player in. You let their choices have feedback loops and consequences to be meaningful. So I know we're coming to an end. That is a lot of information in a short amount of time. But again, I want to come back to the kind of where we started. First, why do we game? Games are a way to allow us to analyze possibilities, alternatives, in a way that allow us to assess risk and opportunities. And I can think of a no more important analytical method as we enter a world that is increasingly at risk. The threat of trade wars, the growing specter of economic coercion, wondering what next crisis tips the world into a war. It is a highly uncertain system. And the more uncertain system, the more you have to think about tendency, potential, and alternatives. And short of, we don't have forecasting methods that deal with that level of complexity. Therefore, games, getting the right players, giving them a series of interesting decisions, letting them interact with one another so that you can analyze it becomes the best way of trying to understand complexity and ultimately keep your eye towards thinking about how do you actually minimize risk and build resilience in your firm or in the economy at large. So I am going to stop sharing and turn it to the moderator now to take questions.